Dr. Savas, welcome to our program, We the People.
I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. Dr. Savas, you are a pioneer of privatization, and can you start by telling us exactly what is privatization?
Okay, let me give you most people think of privatization as a matter of selling off government-owned assets or contracting for public services. It's actually a much broader concept than that. And if I can, the way I define privatization means relying more on the private institutions of society and less on government to satisfy people's needs. Now what do I mean by that? There are actually 4 different major institutions in society that provide people with the goods and services that they want and that they need. There's the family, first of all. The family does, the family, after all, was the original Department of Health, Education, Welfare, Housing, and so on. The second major category is the civil society. That is all the various nonprofit organizations, charities, religious organizations, unions, clubs, volunteer associations, civic groups, community organizations, etc. They too provide people with the things that people need. The marketplace is a third major supplier of goods and services, and finally so is government. So privatization means relying more on these other private institutions of society and less on government to satisfy people's needs. Practically speaking, that means it could be contracting for services, like contracting for garbage pickup or waste removal, contracting to operate homeless shelters, contracting to remove snow, contracting to take care of parks and to prune trees and to mow the grass, etc., to maintain highways, and so forth. It could also mean working with the private sector to build things, for example, either to build things or to share ownership. For example, recently both Chicago and the state of Indiana entered into long-term leases, 99-year leases, with foreign companies to maintain and to operate and maintain their highway systems. The Indiana Toll Road is being operated by a consortium. An Australian company and a Spanish company are working together now. They've taken over the operation of the Indiana Toll Road system. And in Chicago, Mayor Daley did the same thing with the with the Illinois, the Chicago toll road system. Right here in the state of New York, under Governor Pataki, foreign companies, foreign private firms have taken over under long-term leases. They don't own them; they just lease them. They're leasing a couple of airports, one in Niagara Falls and one in upstate here at Newburgh Airport, Stewart Airport in Newburgh, New York. And those are examples of privatization. You see, privatization really means the government and the private sector are working together. Mm-hmm. And the reason why privatization has become so important in the last 20, 30, 40 years is simply that we used to think that government can essentially do everything. We could throw money at the problem through government, and the government could work miracles. We learned, much to our regret, that that's not the case. Government really can't do it. A lot of these other things can't be done by government. For example, teenage pregnancy. Government is really not very good at forestalling or preventing teenage pregnancy. Other societal institutions are better at that, and so forth. And so what we're seeing with privatization is what some people are calling networked government. Because government now is working in networks with the private sector, with nonprofit organizations, with families, with private firms, in order to do this.
Mm-hmm. Why do you consider privatization to be the key to better government?
For just that reason, that government has been trying, for many years, tried to do everything by itself. It was unsuccessful, and a lot of money was wasted and squandered, and a lot of bad social policies came into effect. I call privatization a key to better government because government can use privatization. Privatization is simply a management tool that wise governments are using. And it's being used in America, it's being used throughout the world, it's being used in communist countries, in capitalist countries, in democracies, and dictatorships. Privatization works, if it's done right. It does take, it is a matter of doing it right, because you can botch things up through privatization, just as you can botch things up directly by doing things through the government alone.
What are the, I mean, privatization has its critics, like anything else. What are some of the is there a downside to privatization?
Yes, if it's done poorly, then it's bad. The principal reason why privatization works is because it introduces competition into the delivery of public services. Many public agents, many public services are operated as monopolies, and as we've learned the hard way over millennia, monopolies aren't very good for people. If we have monopolies, they ought to be managed or controlled by government. But when government itself has a monopoly, it's really hard to control it. And so what privatization does is introduce competition, and competition leads to better services, more cost-efficient services, and that's why it works. And the downside then is if you don't do it properly, if you merely trade one monopoly for another one, you may not get the results you want. That's one thing. A lot of the opposition simply reflects it. The socialists used to think that the answer to the worst problem was socialism, Marxism, and so on. They still kind of reflexively oppose it. They feel that somehow private companies are going to take over and steal the public goods and so on and so forth. That's not the case. When it's done right, and it's easy to do it right, it's being done right all over the world, privatization works and gives more cost-effective services, better services, more responsive to the public, and at lower cost.
But Dr. Savas, like anything else, you say that it has to be done right. And like capitalism itself, they say there are excesses of capitalism. And with privatization, which, you know, obviously no one can dispute, you know, its accomplishments. Some critics say, for example, in Bolivia, that Bechtel Corporation tried to privatize the water, which is incredible. But do you know anything about this?
Sure. There have been one of the biggest problems in developing countries is inadequate water supplies, contaminated water, dirty water, not enough water. I've been in countries where water was available only every other day. It was true in Manila, for example. This was true in Hong Kong at one time. And the problem in poor countries is that the poorest people of all really suffer from the inadequate public water supply. By suffer, I mean they pay the most. I've been in cities, Jakarta, for example, and Manila, and elsewhere, where the poorest people have no running water in their homes, and instead water vendors come down the street with donkey-drawn carts and with oil drums, which presumably washed, and they sell water by the cup, by the jug, by people come out of the shacks with plastic jugs, bottles, jars, and buy water. And they pay a lot of money for water like that. In the wealthy parts of town, there's a water system. You go to your kitchen, you turn on the faucet, you have water.
Wow.
So, and the United Nations considers the water problem is about the worst or the second worst problem in the world in developing countries. An enormous number of deaths, children dying, all this bacteria from water.
What's the first problem?
First problem now is considered AIDS.
Oh, okay.
So what a lot of countries in the developing world started doing was to get private firms involved. For this reason, the water supply systems in those countries need expansion, which means big capital expenditures. A lot of money is needed to build dams to capture the water, aqueducts to bring the water to the cities, and 3, distribution systems within the city. And it needs management, and it needs good control, and above all, it needs a lot of money. But the developing countries don't have money for doing this. But what they always claim is we're providing free water, or very low-cost water. In fact, they're not doing that. They're not providing enough water, and the water that's being provided often is contaminated. But the mantra consists of providing free water. So a lot of these countries, and Bolivia is an example, hired private firms. I think that was Bechtel was an American one. Mostly French firms have been involved as well as American companies. And they've been partnerships where the government doesn't sell the water supply system, but simply enrolls a private company to take over the system, to manage the system, to collect the fees for running the system. And these contracts run for maybe 25 years, 30 years, or 50 years. And the private firm, the contracts almost invariably call for a certain amount of expenditure, certain expansion of the water supply system. Right now, we're only providing water to 1 million people. In 2 years, we want to be supplying water to 2 million people, 3 million people, and so on. So these are written into the contract, and the private firm is using private funds that it raises in bond markets and in the capitalist world, if you will, makes those investments, and the agreement is that they're going to be getting paid to do that. Either getting paid by the local government giving the money, or they're being asked to charge the users. The leaders in charge the users. Well, in Bolivia, when this was done, in that case, prices went up from essentially nothing. People started having to pay for water. There was a huge outcry. They were used to getting it free. And populist demagogues, political demagogues would say, water should be free. But these are the same demagogues who hired a private firm in order to supply water to their people.
Right.
And what's going to happen? And so in Bolivia, it's been considered a great victory for the people, because they no longer have a privatized water system, and they're back to where they were before. An inadequate water system, people continue to die from waterborne diseases, and poor people, most of all, pay for the water. It's a terrible fate, and yet momentarily it seems so popular and so desirable. But the people are going to suffer, and they're going to realize that in a few years. Other cities have done this water supply system. American cities have been doing this. Indianapolis, Minneapolis, many cities have been doing this. Jersey City, right across the river, and it works like a charm. It also works in developing countries. In Manila, actually, the price of water went down because the private company that was engaged to operate the system actually fixed a lot of the leaks. There's a lot of leakage in the system. About 40% of the water in the Manila waterworks system was being lost by leaks. They fixed up the pipes, so they didn't even have to, initially at least, they didn't have to build more aqueducts or more dams up in the mountain regions of northern Luzon and the Philippines to bring water to Manila. The water was there, but it was being just leaking out. Another thing, the countries often allow people to steal water without paying it, to tap into the pipes, which means an impaired water supply system, less water for people, and there's still the money is not being paid for, but the public is still being told, the water is a natural right. Water is not a natural right. Water is not a human right. God may provide the rain, but He forgot to provide the pipes to bring it into your kitchen, into your home. Okay? That takes money. Okay? It takes collective action. So, yeah, you can argue, you can say ideologically, water is a natural right. What does that mean? That's meaningless. You want clean water, if you want it coming into your home, it takes money to do that. There's nothing natural about that. It's a very unnatural process.
Right.
You can go to a nearby creek and get it, but otherwise you can't get it.
Right. There's a cost involved in
A huge cost to build dams and aqueducts and water distribution systems, digging up the streets, putting in pipes, putting in faucets, putting in so on. That costs money.
No one can dispute that. What troubled me, concerning that situation was that they were charging people, or they were forbidding people to collect rainwater. Can you figure that one out?
I never heard that. I find that impossible to believe, because you can't. How in the world do you regulate people collecting rainwater? You put out a barrel, you put something on your roof to direct water.
I think they passed a law that it was against the law to collect rainwater because it would compete with the providers of
Well, then it's bad government, okay? Contracts don't allow the private companies to charge any price they want. The contract price, the price for water is very carefully written into the contract, and there's an inflation clause for the next 30 years. It tells exactly how much the price of water should be. There are no surprises there. So again, the demagogic politicians who argue, we're going to protect the people from unfair charges, those are the charges that the government itself entered into a contract with, negotiated with a private firm, because that capital investment has to be paid for. And now that that's happened, of course, a lot of companies are pulling out of that business in developing countries, and essentially the developing countries are being left to their poor water supply, contaminated water, and continued high level of death and disease from their inadequate water supply system, while the politicians there can proclaim it is our national water, it is our national right, and we're not charging for water. You're not charging for water, but then you're not delivering any water either. You're not delivering clean water.
Sure. One of the newest trends, I guess, in privatization is public-private partnerships. And I understand it's very successful in cities like New York, where you have 34th Street, Times Square, all these places that were, having problems. By creating public-private partnerships, they've been able to beautify the streets, the areas. And so tell us a little bit about public-private partnerships.
That's right. Public-private partnerships is a general phrase, meaning essentially be used in any kind of cooperative arrangement between a private firm or a private sector or nonprofit firm and the government agency. And what you're referring to is one of the great successes right here in New York. These are the business improvement districts. And shop owners and property owners in downtown areas, for example, were dissatisfied with the level of public services in their areas. The streets were dirty, the street trees were either not there or not being maintained, the street furniture, the streets looked shabby, the lighting was inadequate, and the security was not good enough. There was not enough security there. And property owners, storekeepers wanted people to be coming there, to be shopping. Property owners wanted their property to be valuable by having valuable stores there, and valuable apartments in the area. And they banded together and they formed these business improvement districts, absolutely voluntary districts formed among property owners in a particular area. And the thing that made it possible was the passage of state legislation making it possible for these organizations, by majority vote of the property owners in a particular defined geographic district, to assess higher property taxes on themselves and to have a board of directors that would utilize those funds collected by the state as part of the property tax and give it to them, that extra amount that was collected, that they voted for, is give it to them, and they use it in order to beautify the area, to make it safer, to make it cleaner, nicer lighting, nicer street signs, et cetera, et cetera. You've seen that blooming all over the city. It started out in Manhattan, and now there are, I think, close to 50 business improvement districts throughout the city. Now you're seeing even not only business improvement districts, but residential improvement districts, where even in areas without a lot of businesses, residents are banding together. This tends to be in the high rent areas, the upper class areas, in order to improve the streets and the livability of the area around their homes.
And what exactly are they? How are they improving the livability? Do you have any idea?
Well, in this way, they're aesthetically, they're cleaning the streets. You very often see special workers cleaning the streets, sweeping the streets, so on. To clean the streets, they have special patrols of men and women in uniform
Security?
To create the safety, the sense of safety, provide safety there. They have no special arrest powers, these people, but they create the sense of security in the area. And they've installed. Instead of having a lot of different boxes with selling various kinds of newspapers and throwaway advertisements, they've aggregated them into these nice, neat-looking collections of boxes, for example, which prettifies the streets. They fix the curbs. They've planted trees, and they've dog-proofed the trees by putting in these metal grates around the trees to protect and preserve the trees from dogs, etc. And so you've got that. You've got foliage, you've got trees, and these groups have also pressed on their members to fix up their storefronts where appropriate, to clean their properties, and they've installed better lighting. In many parts of Manhattan, you see some old-fashioned lighting, which really looks very lovely. Okay, and they put in new kind of street signs which look better, and even certain street signs that are illuminated, going far beyond what the city itself has been doing.
One of the greatest successes of these public-private partnerships that I know of is the Times Square Improvement District, I think they call it. Times Square, that may be the name.
That's right, and also Bryant Park. You're absolutely right. The Times Square Improvement District, there's the 34th Street Improvement District, there's the
Union Square.
Union Square, that's right, and also
Central Park.
Central Park is different. Central Park is a wonderful example of a special kind of public-private partnership. 25 years ago, there was formed the Central Park Conservancy, simply a group of people living in the vicinity of Central Park who deplored the rundown condition of the park. And actually, I was a professor, and that group came to me, and I conducted the first major management study of Central Park in 50 years. One was done in 1925, and then I did my study in 1975, I guess, 50 years. And I cataloged the management problems, and above all, the absence of effective management of the park. It turns out that 11 different units of the Parks Department and other city agencies were responsible for maintaining one or the other aspect of Central Park. And so I argued that what Central Park needed was a single manager, a single executive in charge of Central Park. And Central Park really needed a board of guardians. Because Central Park was essentially an orphan. Nobody had responsibility for it. Everybody had a little piece of responsibility. Nobody was responsible. So I suggested the idea of a board of governors. Well, out of that came the Central Park Conservancy. And that conservancy exists today. It celebrated its 25th anniversary just last year and is doing exceedingly well. It now has a contract with the New York City Parks Department, and it manages the park. It even manages public employees who work in the park, as well as their own workforce that are employees of the Central Park Conservancy. And the park looks magnificent. And one of the things, the Central Park Conservancy gets paid only I think $8 million, only $6 million a year, but they have to put up at least $17 million a year of private money. And so every year the Central Park Conservancy has huge fundraising events, raising funds to put into the park, and they raise $17 million to get only about $6 million or so out of the Parks Department for managing the park. So that's what's going on, and the park looks magnificent. Other parks in the United States have picked up the idea. It's also right here in New York. The Prospect Park has a conservancy now, and another one or two parks have developed their own conservancy.
Dr. Savas, is there any evidence that privatization reduces the cost of delivering public services?
Yes, indeed. This is a very, very well-studied issue. It's been studied throughout the United States. It's been studied in various cities. It's been studied worldwide by the United Nations and by the World Bank. And the evidence is simply overwhelming. Nobody can argue it anymore. In the United States, among cities, the average savings due to privatization, from the best studies available, are about 30%. That is, it costs the public sector about 30% more to provide various kinds of services than it costs private contractors selected under competitive conditions and being monitored by the government for contract performance. Those are huge savings that are available, and this has been proven true in things like in public services like solid waste collection and park maintenance and street maintenance. Also true in things like the library operation. Also true in bus operations. Bus services are a particularly attractive area, but bus privatization has not gone very far in the United States. It's gone nowhere at all in New York City. New York City desperately needs it. But because of the strength of the Transport Workers Union, which avidly blocks privatization, it's not happening here. In the same way, frankly, that the teachers' union is blocking the use of vouchers and so on in public schools. Vouchers are another way, a technique for introducing competition in the delivery of public education services. We know that here in New York, by and large, the public education system is dreadful. The teachers' union, in my opinion, is one of the biggest barriers to effectively improving the school system. Mayor Bloomberg has done a great deal to try to improve that, and is doing well, as is Commissioner Klein. A lot more can be done, and I think competition is the key. Because competition is key. The reason why the private sector does better than the public sector is not because the human beings who work in the public sector are somehow inferior to the human beings working in the private sector. That's not true at all. Okay? The difference is not public versus private. The difference is monopoly versus competition. Competition works. We treasure competition in the World Cup, in the World Series, in the Super Bowl. We know the privatization, that competition is good. But somehow in the public sector, we've worked very, very hard to develop and maintain public monopolies, even when they are not needed, even when you don't need monopolies, and competition can be used in the ways that I suggested here.
Mm-hmm. Government itself is a type of monopoly, right? I mean,
yes, it is, and it has to be, to a great extent. But you can have devolution in the United States. We have, because of the separation of powers, the separation of different levels of government, the federal government is separate and distinct from the state government, and city governments have their own source of authority. So we have three different kinds of governments. So in a sense, there's competition in that respect. But yes, government has a monopoly on the legitimate use of power, and that's as it should be.
Yes, Dr. Savas, can we conclude by telling our listeners and viewers about the comparison between a McDonald's restaurant and I think it was a Department of Motor Vehicles across the street? Do you remember that comparison? Remember that one? Or not? If not, we'll just...
Well, there's that comparison. The comparison, I know you're driving out by the...
There was the article we did.
Yeah, where
It was
McDonald's...
just so clear. It was just so clear.
In McDonald's, they want more customers coming in. Very often in departments of motor vehicles, they don't want people coming in because they have to work.
Mm-hmm.
The best example of that was was a quote some time ago from a post office at about Christmas time. And one postal worker was heard saying to another, "Boy, it's terrible. Look at these crowds of people coming in here. It's awful. Look at all this work up here. It's so crowded here." So on. Across the street was a McDonald's, and they were delighted that people were coming in. The more people that came in, the better it was for the people coming in to buy burgers or whatever, and for the people working there, because it meant that more workers would be hired, their salaries would be raised, and so on and so forth.
So there's more profit.
More customers is good. In the private sector, sometimes it seems that more customers in the public sector is bad, and that's clearly wrong. But I don't want to tar and feather all public employees. These are exceptional cases, but it's very easy, and it's so easy to form it's so easy to like a monopoly if you're the one that has the monopoly.
Mm-hmm.
For example, when I'm consulting in the field of privatization, I would like my offices, my service to be a monopoly.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, there's a lot of competition in privatization consulting. And that's good for the public, it's good for people all over. But it's funny how in the public sector, we've gone to great lengths to protect the public from private monopolies. We've got antitrust laws, we've got a Justice Department with an antitrust unit, we have state antitrust laws, we have the Sherman Act, we have the Clayton Act, all designed to protect the public against monopolies. But we do nothing to protect the public against public monopolies. The implication has been, gee, if it's a public monopoly, it's automatically going to operate in the public interest.
Can you give me an example of a public monopoly, Dr. Savas? Con Ed?
Well, that's a private monopoly, but it's private regulated. Sometimes there are certain services where you need monopolies, and gas supply, electric supply is a necessary monopoly. It used to be the telephone service was a necessary monopoly, but no more. With mobile phones, cell phones, the telephone monopoly has been broken up, and the public has benefited enormously. Telephone prices have gone down, the price of calls gone down, and there are lots and lots of competing suppliers of telephone service. That was not the case once upon a time when AT&T was basically the only telephone provider. At the municipal level, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, New York City Transit Authority, which is a part of it, has a monopoly on bus service. I think that's wrong. I'm a great believer in, for example, well-regulated van services. I've done work with some of the van operators. I'm impressed with the services they provide. Here are cases of immigrants providing much-needed services, providing transportation services in underserved parts of the city, and of course the bus operations, the bus operators, the bus union, and their surrogates. The New York City Council tries desperately to prevent vans from operating, or at least tries to have them operating in ways that they can't effectively function. Like my favorite way of putting it, that the van services are allowed to operate only where they're not needed, maybe on streets where there aren't many passengers. I think van drivers, yes, they're renegade van drivers, but the traffic law should take care of that, and they're well-run van services that have codes of conduct for their members, and they do a good job transporting people at low cost. They can transport people at $1, $1.25, $1.50, far better service than we get for $2 out of it.
Yes, I've seen them out in Jamaica. They're very
yeah,
impressive.
Jamaica's a very good one. And I've met with them. I know the people who run those organizations, both in Jamaica and Queens. And they're very, very impressive entrepreneurs, often from the
Hard
Caribbean,
workers, yeah.
hard working from the Caribbean, and innovative, entrepreneurial. They design ways where when they can close van doors automatically. They develop motorized systems to close the van doors. So you don't have to tug and pull on that door to close the door.
Is the profit motive fundamental for competition, or can you have competition without the profit motive being such an integral part of the competition, if you know what I mean?
That sounds like you think that profit is a dirty word. Profit is not a dirty word. Of course, it's taking risk. Can you have competition without profit? Well, you have competition in sports, right? But ultimately, when the Yankees are competing with the Red Sox, at the root of it all, the winning team is going to get more money. And profit doesn't have to be expressed. I mean, it doesn't have to be expressed directly in dollar terms. I mean, in terms of providing, having a better life for yourself. A farmer, for example, is a farmer operating a profit? Well, he's raising crops and selling crops, and he earns money by doing that. Is that profit, or is that income, or is that his salary, is that wages for his family, and so on? Whatever you want to call it. But there's an economic payoff. If rising at 5 in the morning, going to bed at 9 o'clock at night, there's an economic advantage to doing that. You can call it profit, you can call it something else, but people benefit economically from that, and competition ultimately has some sort of, there's a benefit. You can call it profit, you can call it something else, you can call it feeling good, okay? And that translates into psychic income, if not monetary.
Very well put.
That first picture, that's Mayor John Lindsay of New York. He appointed me first deputy city administrator. That was my first government position. And that's where I finally figured out that things don't really work, and maybe privatization makes a whole lot of sense. On the other end here is another mayor of New York, Mayor Ed Koch. And down here is Mayor Rudy Giuliani. And here's Governor Pataki. And I spent a little bit of time, both with Giuliani and with Pataki, sometimes as a consultant for him. And this was George Bush, who, when he was vice president, I was in the Reagan administration. And over here, one of my prizes here, I'm with President Reagan. That's me in the background, President Reagan, Jim Baker, and Ed Meese over here. President Reagan appointed me Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and I'm there in the cabinet room. And here's this ever-present box of jelly beans, jar of jelly beans, which President Reagan's famous for having jelly beans.
Did people actually eat those?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, the big treat.
He had them.
After I left, when I was getting out of the cabinet room, I tried to be the last one out. I'd take a fistful of jelly beans to give to my staff, to my secretaries and people back in my office. And Crane's Business had an article about me.
Privatizing's high priest, they called you, huh?
That's right. Yeah.
That's pretty good. So let's see.
And over here we have another one, New York Times. That was in the Crane. New York Times had here, let's try the light on over here.
Okay. So what did the New York Times call you, Dr. Savas?
What did they call me? We call it the captain of privatization. The captain of privatization.
Jeez.
And here, by the way, just as you did, they've got some of my books stacked up to show the foreign editions that have been developed.
So, Dr. Savas, tell us about your publications.
Well, I've written 15 books so far, and they've been translated to 21 languages. There are 21 foreign editions, in other words, of my books. My earliest book is this one, published by McGraw-Hill. It's actually on a different topic, computer-controlled industrial processes. And it was path-breaking at the time, I guess. It was translated into Japanese, Romanian, and Italian. Then after that, my first book on privatization was 1977. And a couple of books then in 1982. I even wrote a book with my first real book on privatization was this one. How to privatize the public sector, how to shrink government. It was a pretty aggressive title at the time.
What year was that again?
This was 1982.
Huh.
And it deliberately had that kind of a provocative title, basically in order to get people's attention. This is one of the books I'm really most proud of. It's actually, I'm the junior author. My 17-year-old son was the senior author of this book on teaching children to use
He wrote that when he was 17?
He wrote that when he was 17.
Mm.
And I really helped him. Then I wrote a book on Moscow city government because during the latter part of the Cold War, after the Nixon-Brezhnev détente agreement, I became the American director of a joint U.S.-USSR project on the management of large cities. I was the American director. My counterpart was a deputy mayor of Moscow. And I wound up writing this book on the Moscow city government with a colleague of mine, John Kaiser.
Moscow city government. Huh.
Yeah. Then I did my major book on privatization. My first major book on privatization was in 1989, called Privatization, the Key to Better Government. And this one got translated a lot. This got translated or published.
Show us the Arabic edition. I think it's interesting to see the same thing in Arabic.
The Arabic edition. Same one, the 1989 book, Arabic. It starts from the back, of course, the way Arabic is. Okay. And there's also a Greek edition. That's this one. This one's called Privatization and Productivity. Change the name to that one. Then there's a French edition, La Privatisation, and then a couple of Spanish editions. La Clave para un Gobierno Mejor, Privatización, and it came out of 2 different editions.
And then there's a Portuguese one that was actually done in Brazil. That's this one. Same translation, same title, obviously. Then the Turkish one. There's a Turkish edition, and then came the Russian edition. Privatizacija, Klučki Rumki, meaning key to markets. Then this is the Polish edition, again, Privatization, key to markets. And then a Bulgarian edition. So I got 3 different Slavic editions of 3 different languages. Bulgarian, Privatization. And then came a Korean edition. That's this one, Privatization of Key to Better Government. Pretty tight, pretty covering. Then, I'm not counting this. This is a study done here in New York City. But for New York State, this Privatization for New York, Competing for a Better Future, a report of the New York State Senate Advisory Commission on privatization. Then my more recent class is this one, privatization.
Oh yeah, this is the latest, right?
This is actually not the latest. It was published in the year 2000, but this one also has been getting translated. Even countries that don't read this translation. But here's one from Azerbaijan. They translated that 2000 book of mine from Azerbaijan. And the alphabet is very much like Turkish. The Azeri language.
Where do they speak that language?
Azerbaijan.
Is that a country?
That's a country.
Never heard of it.
Azerbaijan is where Baku, you hear the city of Baku?
No.
Baku is a big, was where the petroleum industry was developed, as a matter of fact. Anyway, then they did it in Lithuania. They came out with 2 volumes, okay, with some co-authors there because they added some of their own material. Then came the Chinese edition. Then the Taiwanese didn't like the Chinese edition, so they did their own.
I love
Look
it.
at this one. Look at this one.
Public-private partnerships.
That's right. So that's the title of the 2000 book.
Right.
Then I did a different book called The New Public Management. It's actually an edited book by
New Public Management.
Lessons from Innovating Governors and Mayors.
Mm-hmm.
And then last year, I did this one, Managing Welfare Reform in New York City. It's a story of what the study of what Mayor Giuliani accomplished.
Dr. Savas, thank you so much.
My pleasure, Carlos.
This has been an interview with E.S. Savas, a pioneer of privatization. We the People can be seen each week on thelivewebcast.com. I'm Carlos Fabara. Thank you for watching.